Fernando Wirtz is research fellow at the University of Kyoto, and his research focuses on idealism, on Japanese philosophy, on Chinese philosophy, and on intercultural philosophy. Among his publications, I'll name the 2022 article entitled Miki Kiyoshoshi's Philosophy of History and the Historical Role of Myth, and the article entitled The Concept of Angst in Schelling's Philosophy of Mythology, which was published in 2020 in the Schelling article. I
think Fernando should be on the
Yeah. So Fernando, can you hear us?
Yeah, thank you very much. I will share my screen now. Can you see?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, and can you hear me well?
We hear you well here, yeah.
Perfect. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, to the organizers for creating this opportunity to discussing these topics. I think this is very, very necessary. So I will go straight to my paper. I will talk about Schelling's philosophy of mythology and the problem of primitivism, and I will actually talk also about racism, mainly in Schelling. Okay, I start. A rare book from 1825 bears the title The alten Pelasga und ihre Mysterien, also the ancient Pelasgians and their mysteries. Its author was a pastor, the pastor Christian Gottlob Eisner, about whom we have very little information besides being the author of a small handful of books. This book has an extremely strange format, no section separations and an abundance of disorder, quotations from Greek philological sources, which makes it practically unreadable. The interesting thing about this book is its task in attempting to show that the Pelasgians, the people referred to by Herodotus as the ancestors of the Hellenic people, were Black, suggesting also that the Pelasgians created or at least influenced the Hellenic mysteries. This rarity serves as a testimony to a moment in German intellectual history when the question of the origin of the human being and the origin of human wisdom, culture, and mythology was intensely discussed in the field of Altertumsforschung, so classical studies. This question overlapped philological, archaeological, ethnological, and philosophical problems. Some passages from Schelling's work also exemplify this debate. In the context of these debates, Schelling and others reached conclusions that, from our contemporary perspective, seem not only wrong, but also ethically reprehensible. This is the case, for example, of the lesson 21 of the presentation of the purely rational philosophy, the Darstellung der reinrationalen Philosophie, a text that belongs to the later Schelling, where Schelling speculates on a hierarchy of races, placing the Black race at the lowest level, and concludes with regard to slavery. So I will read the final passage of this lesson as an introduction, and then I will reconstruct a little bit the context. But first I want to show you this, that is the most problematic statement. So Schelling is discussing slavery, and contrary to Herder, he's not criticizing slavery. Surprisingly, he kind of advocates slavery, and then he finalizes saying, to go into further details, especially into the question, what was more humane, to use the means of a great world-dominating power to give the Black trade its true purpose, or to prevent it by force, not without causing greater cruelties and perpetrating cruelties oneself, but especially to cut off the only way of salvation of thousands of beings who, at least in their disposition, were human, to go into this question, that is, to go into the practical and political side of the matter in general, is neither our function nor the function of this place. So he ends up saying, I will not discuss the problem whether slavery should be prevented using force or we should allow it. I will not go into this. As we will see, this statement is the conclusion of Schelling's metaphysics of race. By excluding the practical and political side of the problem from the philosophical reflection, Schelling is not only taking a political, but I will also argue a philosophical attitude. I think that in face of these kind of statements, as the one I just quoted, the scholarship of German idealism usually adopts one of the following attitudes. A, treat them as epochal statements influenced by restricted knowledge about other cultures that we could call historical relativism. Treat them as historical aberrations, logical aberrations that have nothing to do with the systematic core of Schelling's philosophy, or treat them systematically as elements of Schelling's philosophy endowed with the same status as the other parts of his work, and therefore like invalidating the whole totality of his work. Admittedly, this list is not exhaustive. We could also invoke interpretative charity, consequentialism, etc. It is true also that in studying philosophical authors, one must select aspects of their work. This is what interpretative work consists of. The mere reproduction of the totality will bring nothing new to the work itself. In this sense, selection on the basis of a certain criterion of relevance seems to be more of a methodological necessity. But what will speak in favor of excluding race from a philosophical discourse? Alternatives A and B remain popular, with B being the easier to deal with. Even to think Schelling against himself, or when some people write about think Hegel against himself, or things like that, I think it's another alternative to B, just separating the logic from the historical context. Of course, no one wants to accept C, since this will imply discarding the philosophy of an author in its totality, although some generalizations, such as saying that the concept of reason already contains the seeds of fascism, are popular in some circles. For years, the omission of the problem of race and the treatment of non-European cultures in studies of German idealism were seen as symptoms of a meta-philosophical issue operating in the workings of philosophical analysis. In this sense, Eurocentrism is as much a philosophical as an institutional, knowledge-driven, and epistemological paradigm. Even authors who explicitly advocate for the diversification of the academic's curricula tend to use indulgent expressions. I quote Elberfers, who I like very much, but he writes, this exclusion, so he writes regarding precisely to the problem of racism in German idealism, he writes, this exclusion of the historical circumstances of the topics that are compromising from today's perspective, at the same time forms the blind spot, the blinden Fleck of this tradition of philosophizing, that is German idealism. Is there a way to maintain the value of Schelling's thought without considering his epistemic distortions a blind spot? I would like to argue for an alternative, analyzing the problematic propositions of a classical thinker not only lead to a distinction between should not only lead to a distinction between valid and invalid propositions, or a separation between logic and politics, or philosophy and history, as Schelling somehow seems to suggest in the last paragraph. On the contrary, instead of analyzing these passages as blind spots or reinterpreting them in a different language against the author, it is necessary to use them as positive epistemic tools that reveal how a certain logic operates. This need not lead to a complete invalidation of the system, but to a philosophical historical critique of any metaphilosophical intention that attempts to separate logic from politics. And very briefly, I want to introduce Schelling's philosophy of mythology. You know, maybe Schelling's philosophy of mythology belongs to the late Schelling. I will just make a drafted. Although studies on the relationship between colonialism, racism, and the philosophy of general idealism have grown in recent years, Schelling as a figure remains relatively understudied in relation to this topic. This is in a sense paradoxical, since Schelling, in many cases, is much comprehensible than Kant, Fichte, or Hegel in including information and references to what we will call today other cultures. In fact, Schelling's philosophy seems to give a greater importance to the conceptual space of the otherness. In this respect, his philosophy of mythology certainly offers a unique case. While the philosophy of mythology deals with the development of mythical and religious consciousness throughout human history, Schelling's valorization of different mythological systems offers conceptual tools for thinking about the possibility of religious or even cultural pluralism. Perhaps Schelling's great stake in his philosophy of mythology is his thesis that mythology is not merely an illusion of the primitive religious imagination, but corresponds to a necessary moment in the unfolding of religious consciousness through its potencies, the potencies of God. In fact, Schelling goes a step further. For him, not only is mythology a necessary moment, but the very content of mythology, which are the potencies of God, you know, Schelling has a theory about the potencies of God. The content of mythology is essentially God itself, only that it is presented in a rhapsodic manner. Not only does Schelling theoretically postulates the epistemic value of these mythological systems, he also substantiates it empirically and historically by means of a careful study of numerous philological sources. Thus, he seems genuinely interested in these mythical systems, in their conceptual richness and sensual multiplicity. In his lessons on the philosophy of mythology, it is possible to find his interpretation of Zoroastrianism, Chinese worldview, Egyptian, Hindu, and Greek mythology. Far from mentioning these subjects in passing, Schelling's philosophy seems to be a genuine work on myth, with the philological sources that were available to him. It could be said that once Schelling placed at the very heart of reality in God a multiplicity of potencies, he left the door open to religious pluralism, or at the very least, to a kind of inclusivism. However, reading carefully the text belonging to Schelling's philosophy of mythology, many of these promises are not fulfilled. In particular, far from Schelling's religious critical inclusivism leading to a greater cultural tolerance, what we find in this text is the exclusion, sometimes total, of non-European cultures from history. Interestingly, this exclusion is by means of philosophical reasoning, not merely reason on the basis of extra philosophical prejudices. Of course, to support the latter claim, the idea that Schellingian philosophy works toward exclusion requires to some extent to reconstruct Schelling's philosophy of mythology that I cannot do now. But just very quickly, this Schelling's philosophy of mythology can be understood as a chapter within a larger narratology a cosmogonic Darstellung, cosmogonic narration. This narrative can be found, if read properly, in the final 4 volumes of Schelling's complete works, edited by his son, and can be summarized as follows. I will not summarize the whole thing, but basically Schelling tells the story of creation. He tells how in the beginning these 3 potencies exist somehow peacefully in their latency within God. God decides, this is an act of freedom, God decides to create the world and sets these potencies in tension, and the unfolding of the potencies is what generates the creation of the world and the natural process. And at the end of this natural process, we have the human being, and the human being created by after the image of God is able to create, somehow put in motion a second creation, what Schelling calls a second creation, that is precisely the original sin, that is human beings, the original human being is able to set a new motion, a new tension into motion by distancing itself from God. And since the human being was created in the image of God, God has the capacity, the human, has the capacity to act freely, to set the first potency, the potency of selfhood, of egoism in motion, and restart a second creation in the human consciousness. This is the original sin, a new process of estrangement from God caused by the human being itself. Mythology is the phenomenology of this process. It is the history of religious consciousness in its return to the Trinitarian unity of the potencies. So what Schelling tells us about the different systems of mythology is basically this struggle within the human religious consciousness between the different representations of different gods. What is interesting to me is that this religious consciousness produces also what we will call like the empirical history, the development of cultures, the development of peoples. And then I go to Schelling's speculative ethnology. This is the starting point of Schelling's ethnoanthropological speculation. Schellingian philosophy does not limit itself to explaining the possibility of the concept of the human being in the realm of ideas. It also seeks to explain the empirical existence of human beings. To study religious consciousness, Schelling relies, as stated earlier, on concrete mythological systems, which are products of various cultures. In this sense, it is a crucial task for Schelling to explain the origin of peoples. There are 2 important passages where Schelling deals with the empirical development of human beings. The first is lesson 5 of the historical critical introduction into the philosophy of mythology. And the second one is the one I read before, lesson 21st of the presentation of the pure rational philosophy. And in lesson 5 of the historical critical introduction, Schelling begins by asking, how did peoples emerge into being? In short, his solution consists in placing religious consciousness, the potencies themselves, in their interaction with human consciousness as the cause of the origin of peoples. This means that Schelling rejects any kind of biological, geographical, or physical explanation of the origin of peoples. Neither migration, nor population growth, nor environmental change have priority. Likewise, he rejects here the explanatory priority of races. although he does not reject the existence of human races per se. According to him, peoples are not the result of racial differences. On the contrary, racial differences are in any case a consequence of mythical consciousness. So it looks something like this. So everything that happens in the religious consciousness gets reflected in the historical, empirical history or social development. To explain the origin of peoples, Schelling introduces the idea of a spiritual crisis that resulted in the transition from the original undivided humanity and the existence of different cultures to the existence of different cultures. He describes this crisis as a destruction of the original unity, which serves to explain more precisely the distinction between people, folk, and tribe, Stamm. Non-European groups that do not constitute a people present a difficulty for Schelling's system insofar as their place within his religious taxonomy is difficult to classify. And among these groups, Schelling includes Chinese, South American indigenous people, Africans, and so on. On the most innovative one, nevertheless, one of the most innovative aspects of Schelling's philosophy is his non-linear interpretation of history. Both texts investigated here, the two lessons that I'm talking about, aimed at questioning the idea of a linear development from a primitive and clumsy proto-human being to one endowed with reason. So also Schelling rejects this idea of kind of evolutionary theory of development. This relates to Schelling's system of the times, which is conceived stratigraphically, not linearly. For this very reason, in some passages, Schelling defends a very interesting thesis against cultural evolutionism. And I think this quote is very interesting. So he writes, "The epochs do not differentiate themselves from each other by a mere more or less of a so-called culture. Their differences are internal, are differences of essentially or qualitatively varying principles that follow each other and each of which in its epoch can achieve the highest development." In other words, what determines the character of an epoch is the structure of the potencies, not the psychological development of human beings. For this reason, even racial differences cannot originate from any kind of degeneration or evolution for Schelling. I read this second quote also in regarding what we will call the primitive peoples. Schelling writes, or what had been called primitive peoples. Schelling writes, "They refute most definitely the illusion of such a stupid primordial condition of the human species, in that they indicate that from out of such a condition, no progress is possible." So against maybe people like Humboldt, who set the primitive peoples as precisely the primitive form of society, Schelling says, this is nothing can come out from these tribes, right? So therefore he's against a linear evolutionary theory of culture. Going back to the idea of the crisis that I mentioned divided humanity into two groups. The first developed into people, the second remained excluded from history. This excluded group of people was the result of the unconquered angst of losing unity. For even after the dispersion, the angst did not leave them. So for Schelling, the people that remain outside history is because they didn't conquer this angst after the lost of the primeval unity. And in relation to these people, the tribes, the ununified hordes, Schelling says, they are the still living testimony of the completed, utterly unrestrained dissolution of the entire course of the dispersion has been realized in them. Actually, they are properly the flock that grazes without shepherd, and without becoming a people, they were annihilated in just the crisis that gave the peoples determinate being. So why a group of the group that will become the crisis gives some peoples their determinate being, and some other groups of humans the crisis excludes them from history. Okay, so now final section, the question of race. Lesson 21 of the Darstellung der reinrationalen Philosophie is even more explicit. Here, Schelling again mentions the crisis that separated the material world from the world of ideas, although he introduces a concept not so clearly explained in his historical critical lessons, the concept of the man, the Mensch, who acts as the unifying idea of all human beings. So for Schelling, in the world of ideas, there is also an ideal man, the Mensch. And he says, referring to him, with this unity, the unified origin of the humankind is also given. For in regard to reality, the kinds that precede in the idea are referred to the one, who is then the one who can really exist through himself. With him and through him, they also first step out of the world of ideas and into material existence, each in its own way, according to its level, Stufe, and in the place, Ort, determined for it. It seems that it is man himself who caused the crisis, which is only a natural conclusion, and it features in other Schellingian texts. The difference between this text and the historical critical lessons is that here Schelling seems to assert more radically an essential difference between the human races as something contained in the ideal necessity of the world of ideas. Their level and place seem to be determined in the idea. And I read the second quote. Differences such as those of Kafir, Abyssinian, Egyptian, go back to the world of ideas. So it seems that here Schelling defends an even stronger essentialism. Furthermore, on the lowest level, closer to the animals, this is a quote by Schelling, as Schelling explicitly points out, he locates the black race. What is interesting about this, beyond the numerous disqualifications that Schelling employs to refer to people of color, is that the philosopher seems also aware to the moral danger of his theory. Far from criticizing the slave trade, Schelling remains resolute regarding the metaphysical conclusions of his system. This is a longer quote, but I will read it very quickly. So this is when Schelling discusses slavery. He says, "It is better, I say, to confess openly that in our opinion, it could not possibly have been an evil misanthropic spirit with which the noble Las Casas, this missionary that was in South America, put into action the idea of using the strong African race for the exploitation of the discovered silver and gold mines instead of the weak American race. A thought that, however, did not result in black slavery, for the unfortunates already had this at home in the most hideous form, but it did result in the export of black, in which a benevolent spirit could at the same time see only the means of snatching that abandoned humankind from the most terrible barbarism, and many of the souls lost almost without salvation from eternal death. For in the animal too, there is a selfish will, a desire which it insists on itself, its own being. But this will, as has been noted in its time, is a merely excited one, thus accidental in regard to the animal, in which it has no actual self, nothing supermaterial, which could outlast the material being of the animal. The text remains at least ambiguous about whom Las Casas intended to save, but it would seem that by replacing South Americans with black slaves, he intended to save the South Americans as well as the animal soul of the black slaves from mistreatment. The reference to the animal soul lacking eigentliche Selbst in the context of the text seems to refer to the semi-savage state of the black tribes mentioned by Schelling a little bit later. So very quickly, my conclusion. In reading these two lessons in Schelling's late philosophy, there is an undeniable continuity alongside some tensions. For example, the role of the intelligible word seems to be absent in the historical critical introduction. The philosophical and metaphilosophical question at issue here is what to do with these statements by Schelling. And I want to make three observations. Schelling's speculative ethnology is consistent with his theory of potencies, according to which the way in which the potencies are articulated produces in reality different levels of organization and disorganization. And B, to avoid thinking of Schelling's ethnology as a blind spot, it should be noted that his position is found on sources he considers authoritative. The fact that he selects certain testimonies while ignoring others shows not a blind spot, but rather willful blindness. And C, to avoid thinking Schelling about himself without falling into a vain philosophical apostasy, it is necessary to think plainly and simply against Schelling, a task naturally both more difficult and ambitious. Admittedly, one can explore the potential of alternatives that Schelling failed to see. For example, instead of seeing the original crisis that separated humanity as an exclusivist process, one could think of a spiritual crisis that marked all cultures, placing all religious and cultural manifestation as possible alternatives to the universal condition of human being. Going beyond Schelling implies not only a critical evaluation of his racist ideas in order to separate the weft from the chaff or the spirit from the letter, but also to question the status of the alleged historical presuppositions contained in his system. A fine separation between historical content and logic is usually advocated by scholars of German idealism, but this separation is simply a fiction. It is the task of critical contextualism to conceptualize not the separation, but the complicity between logic and politics. As such, the non-linearity of Schelling's thought, far from disarming pseudo-scientific hierarchies, essentialized them in an abstruse way. Whereas biologism is capable of leaving the door open to the possibility of an ontological kinship between one race and another, in Schelling's case, this possibility is denied. The extent to which the lessons analyzed here destabilize the entire Schellingian system depends on the degree of consistency one seeks to endorse. But this is not the purpose of this paper. It seems evident that the same logic that operates in the case of non-European peoples operates behind other exceptional processes within Schelling's system. Studying the case of non-European cultures, Schelling gives us a perspective on the systematic functioning of his philosophy, although this does not necessarily mean an outright invalidation of his whole thought. Yeah, thank you very much. These are some of the references I used in self-promotion of my book where I talk about this. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much for that. We have 10 or so minutes for the Q&A. So if you have any questions, go ahead. Steve. Okay, so if you have any questions, go ahead and use the raise hand function or Carlo.
Okay, Fernando, thank you very much for your very interesting paper. I'd like to ask if but you could expand a bit on this notion of speculative ethnology that you mentioned at some point. Because while listening to you, I was wondering what exactly the status could be of Schelling's assertions on this development of human races. So it's clear it has a kind of speculative side to it, because it assumes a single primordial identity, which then somehow is transformed into a plurality. There's a Christ transformed, and from there you find this development according to various stages. So you can recognize something of Schelling's philosophical program, but I think your point is also that this form is filled with hugely problematic contents, and so we get a strange mixture between a speculative form and empirical content, kind of inserted into this form more or less arbitrarily. And so I'm not sure what my question is, but I was wondering if Schelling himself gives us any clues as to what he thought to be the status of what he was doing. Yes, because it's clearly not just speculative logic, it's clearly not transcendental philosophy, it's something else. And did he somehow account for what he was doing?
Thank you very much. Yeah. Yeah, you're totally right. It's a weird mixture between empirical sources and the structure of his system. I term it speculative ethnology because his main point is that the development of the peoples of the Völker does not depend of any empirical event, let's say, but it's always a reflection of the division that happens in the religious consciousness. So he says a causality, a causal relation between what happens within the religious consciousness, and the religious consciousness is mythology and then Christianity, but now we are in the field of mythology. So so Schelling imagines that these potencies fight within the human consciousness, and sometimes one of the potencies, the potencies of the potency of selfhood, is the first potency, occupies the hegemonic place. So when the potency of selfhood occupies the hegemonic place, we have some configurations. We have some gods, like the god of death in Hades in the Greek mythology, or Seth in the Egyptian mythology. And then when other potency occupies the hegemonic place, the hegemonic position, we will have other religion, other configuration, other gods. So for Schelling, this movement that happens in the religious consciousness gets reflected in how the peoples, how the human societies develop themselves. He is, for me, it's also very interesting the use of empirical material, because one of the things I want to argue is also, I mean, not today, but what I argued before is that the philosophy of mythology, one of the interesting points of Schelling's philosophy of mythology is that he tries to rehabilitate precisely the role of empirical things, empirical representation of gods. So he takes a lot of care into representing these mythologies well, and he investigates not just the stories, but he also investigates the visual representation of the gods. So he puts a lot of interest in what we will call the sensual dimension of religious practices. And also his positive philosophy, the so-called positive philosophy of Schelling, is a philosophy that he, in many passages, he describes as a philosophy of experience, but not a philosophy of experience in the pure scientific empirical sense, but in a kind of religious sense. It's a religious experience. That's why sometimes I also talk about a phenomenology of the religious consciousness. I don't know if somehow your question was in that direction. I cannot hear so well the people on the floor also.
Oh, really? Okay, we'll try to speak louder then. Okay, so we have two more questions. The next one is from Henning. Maybe I'll pass you this so you can see you.
Okay, many thanks, Fernando, for this talk. Can you hear me?
Nice to see you.
Thanks for the presentation. One thing that irritated me a bit was your claim that Schelling essentializes races, because I take him to do the opposite. Because, and according to your own presentation, which is slightly as correct, it seems that Schelling ultimately claims that the first causes of racial differences are cultural rather than biological. So if he does anything, it seems that he culturalizes the notion of race, which means that racial differences can also disappear again in different cultural circumstances. So I wonder what you do with this objection.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, you're right. What I meant is that at least in this, the 21st lesson of the presentation of the pure rational philosophy, in this lesson, Schelling seems in fact to essentialize races, because he says the differences between Egyptian and Abyssinian are already contained in the world of ideas. He textually says this. But you are totally right that in the historical critical introduction to philosophy of mythology, he precisely criticized this idea of race. So this is a tension between the tension I mentioned between the two lessons. And of course, there are some arguments, there are some, I think, some possible answers to why this happens. And maybe you probably know that the Darstellung der reinrationalen Philosophie is the thing that it seems that's the last thing that Schelling wrote, and it's the thing that the son of Schelling was very heavily edited by the son of Schelling. Nevertheless, I don't think that the son of Schelling really introduced these weird ideas into the lesson. This lesson is very weird. Also, if you read the whole Darstellung, Schelling is actually talking about Aristotle and the potencies, and suddenly there is the 21st lesson, he talks about dinosaurs, and he really talks about dinosaurs. He talks about okay, the human races and so on. So it's a very weird lesson, and I agree with you. It stays in tension with the historical critical introduction. One of my questions was, okay, how we deal with this material, right? So this is one of the open questions: how we deal when we find this kind of thing in a thinker.
Okay, so we have still two questions. So the next one comes from Gudrun Zoller.
Thank you. And thank you for the presentation and for the focus on the late material here. That said, I must admit to an irritation also with regard to Schelling, not only to Herder in that particular regard, the late Schelling. I think that in Schelling, the presence of these racial prejudices is different in kind from its presence in the other authors that we have in the vicinity. I see it as part of his positivism, of his program of introducing a rational form of philosophy under the heading positive philosophy that allows him to introduce what you just referred to as higher kind of experience. And you get the suspicion around the material that you presented today that this is just an either intentional or unintentional open door to the cultivation of prejudices of all kind. And I would like to take even a sympathetic look at the term prejudice, going back to its rehabilitation by Gadamer, but still a dimension that is in need of revision, revisiting on the part of the author himself, Schelling, and also on our part. So would you agree that there is a tie-in to the level of racism and other such things, in particular now to the positivist program of the late Schelling? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I didn't hear one word. There is something regarding the racism?
That the linkage is even more intimate, internal to the positivism program of the late Schelling.
Thank you, thank you. Yes, yes. Yeah, I tend to agree with that. I like that definition of prejudice as something that needs to be revisited. Still, for me, it seems I'm irritated also, but I'm irritated at Schelling because we expect something that Schelling doesn't offer. That's my irritation, and of course there are some. That's why I also quote this passage when he criticized this linear reading of history, of cultural history. And there are passages that really offer us, or seems to open the door to something completely different. But at the end, we don't find this. And still, for me, his prejudices are still too. At the end, the way that he conducts all this prejudice to the end, I don't see some way out. But I am also a Schelling scholar, so of course I'm also irritated by. I'm also trying to maybe I cannot escape of thinking Schelling against himself. But I think that there are also limits to think Schelling against himself. But yeah, coming to the question of positivism, I also agree with that. I agree that the late Schelling has a special interest into reivindicating the positive aspect of history, the concreteness of history. And Schelling scholars struggle about what Schelling means by this, what Schelling means by positive, what Schelling means by afar with experience, right? So yeah, I would like to hear more about that your critique, because I think that totally there is you're right with that, but I still, for me, there are still too many broken promises in Schelling that I cannot still I don't know how to deal with that.
Okay, so we'll come back to Gunter Solo shortly because he's our next speaker. But before we do that, we have a question from Jimena.
Thank you. Hi, Fernando. How are you?
Hola, Jimena.
Well, I really liked your talk, and maybe just the reason is all this that you were just mentioning, what to do with this material that it breaks our heart, and how to read and how to separate, as you said, spirit from letter, or context from logic. or how to find a way to not toss the author and the books away and keep something that is that is enriching for us. So I just wanted to ask you if you could say something more about this perspective that you called critical contextualism, and how maybe that way of reading Schelling and finding this complicity between logic and politics could help in finding a way.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I like that you paid attention to that word, because I tried to put some emphasis in that expression of critical contextualism. I don't know exactly what it means yet. It's maybe also a promise. So I think that, and I mean, this happens to me. I don't create this idea that when I mentioned that Schelling was a racist in some Schelling conference, there is always someone that wants to relativize it, right? So how to deal with this? And of course, there is a matter of historicity, so that's something that we cannot negate. So these kind of statements have a historical context, but in the same historical context, we also find people like Herder, for example. So it was not just a one-way road. So these authors had many possibilities of thinking about other cultures, I think. And the other point is how to deal with this kind of thing without invalidating the whole system. And I will say, on the one hand, okay, it's easier also to use this as just to write some history of ideas. So, okay, we can say contextualize Schelling in the whole debate about the origin of the peoples in the 19th century. There is an interesting book from Maurice Hollander that is called The Language of Paradise, where he talks about a debate in philology about the origin of language. There is another book, interesting book about Adam's ancestors, that is about a debate regarding if there were some humans before Adam, right? So all these new discoveries in the field of archaeology in that time led to a lot of discussion, and that's very interesting. And I think on the one hand we can put Schelling in that picture, in that framework, and use it to understand better the framework itself. But how we understand Schelling, including these things, including these passages. And I think one way of doing that will be then to use these passages as a positive epistemic tool to show how Schelling's logic operates. And at the end, it's true. At the end, I think this just will show us the limit of Schelling. At some point, we have to get away from Schelling. So this is the sad conclusion. But I think at some point we have to do this, right? I think there is always a tendency to save the author in some sense, that maybe we have a wrong representation of what we are doing when we criticize an author. We are not, I don't know, we are not, Schelling is not here, right? So it's not that we are really criticizing, hurting a real human being. So there are many things involved, and sometimes I feel that in the scholarship there is a kind of tolerance or an attitude of restraining oneself when it's the time to get out, to really depart ways with these authors. But of course, there are different. We as philosophers do different things. We do sometimes history of ideas. Sometimes we are just interpreting the author. So we have to first decide in what field we are. But yeah, I wanted just to open the question because this is what this conference is about. So how we deal with this, and yeah.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much for that talk.
Thank you.
Now it's time to get irritated with Hegel, maybe with the Roman Empire. So our next speaker is Wirtz, and his talk is entitled Colonizing the Colonizer, Hegel on the Germanic Conquest of the West Roman Empire and its world